But our interview for today with Candida Moss from Notre Dame University, who teaches New Testament there, she's written a new book that advances the thesis that a lot of these martyr stories are, in fact, myths.
Well, does Notre Dame know she wrote this book? That seems like
she was immediately kicked out.
Something they would be not pleased with.
No, from reading the book, you get the idea that this stuff is fairly common knowledge in the academic, and it's just about addressing that popular belief that for the first 300 years of Christianity that they were systematically and continuously persecuted.
Her book is The Myth of Persecution, and we had a fascinating interview with her that we're going to share with you now.
Joining us by telephone is Candida Moss. Candida is the author of a new book, The Myth of Persecution, How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. Candida is professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame. Candida Moss, thank you very much for joining us on Reasonable Doubts today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I found this book fascinating. I wanted to ask you, looking over your past publications, you've written several books on early Christian martyrdom. So what is it about the subject of early Christian martyrdom that piques your interest? And is the answer that you give to this question, is it going to be different as a scholar than as a person of faith?
Well, I've been interested in martyrdom for a while, and I think when I initially got interested in it, I just found the stories so fascinating. These are great stories. You just want to hear them. And I just sort of wanted to tell people about how important ideas about martyrdom were in the early church. And then gradually I realized that sort of today people have a lot of misconceptions about what happened to early Christians, and I sort of wanted to correct those misconceptions, even though I really appreciated these stories. I would say that I initially got interested in martyrs as a person of faith who was sort of drawn to these stories. And the reason that I wrote this book was because as a scholar, I felt that I couldn't allow other Christians to sort of perpetuate these myths about what had happened in the early church. So yeah, there's sort of a difference between my scholarly interests and my interests as a Christian.
Well, we hear it all the time in Sunday school and in political debates. You know, Christians are relentlessly persecuted because of their faith, and this has been going on since, the very early years of the Christian movement, especially those first 300 years, where we're supposed to believe that, apparently Christians were systematically hunted down by the Romans for roughly 300 years. So the question is, what is wrong with this view of history?
I think what's wrong with this view of history initially, it's just wrong. This is not what our historical evidence leads us to believe. Whenever we have Romans inaugurating these brief periods of persecution, and we're only talking about really 2 brief periods, but they start with legislation that makes it clear that Christians were very comfortable and even flourishing in the Roman Empire. So the first reason why it needs correction is simply that it's wrong. But it's not just that it's inaccurate. It's not just that, we've overblown this myth. The problem is that people still think this, and they think it in ways that affect how they act today. So Christians today talk about themselves and think about themselves as persecuted because of this history of persecution. They sort of identify with Jesus, they identify with the early church, and they say that they're persecuted just like Jesus and the apostles. And when we look at the evidence and realize that the early church wasn't persecuted, then that has to force us to think about whether or not we're persecuted now.
For about 8 years under the Roman Empire Decius, there was actual legislation in place that forced Christians to choose between sacrificing to the imperial cult or remaining loyal to Christ. Now, if they refused, of course, they would be executed. Why was this legislation put in place? And couldn't this perhaps be rightly seen as Christian persecution?
The first thing I would say is even that edict, the Edict of Decius, which for a long time we did think was persecution of Christians, all of our evidence for its implementation comes from a single month. So in terms of this legislation being in place for 8 years, we don't know that it was in place for 8 years. It all comes from 1 month. And was this legislation that forced Christians to do something that they felt they couldn't do? Yes, it was. I think what we need to take into account here is what the Emperor Decius was trying to do was to get people to come back to the imperial cult. He was doing that in order to sort of fortify the empire, to please the gods, and to sort of unify the empire so that it would be stronger in defending itself against attack. Now, in doing that, he wasn't doing anything new. This is what Romans had been doing for centuries beforehand. They had wanted people to participate in this cult. So this wasn't a religious innovation. And when he did it, maybe he knew, maybe he had a sneaking suspicion that there might be this small group of people that wouldn't be willing to do this. But it's not as if he was thinking, let's go get the Christians. So I guess what I would say is this law is unjust, and it's particularly unjust from our perspective as moderns. But at the time, it was very acceptable, and Decius really had the moral high ground. And it wasn't persecution because he wasn't targeting Christians. He was asking people to do something that they were already supposed to be doing under law.
Now, Jews were exempted under these laws. Is that correct? Because they were an older monotheistic faith?
To an extent, although archaeological evidence suggests that the Jews had negotiated sort of a compromise with the Romans, but they did have special status because Judaism was a religion. It was this ancient religion, and the Romans knew that the Jews were very serious about their monotheism. They could look back at the stories of the Maccabees and know that they really didn't want to cause trouble. At the same time, they weren't evangelizing. They weren't out to win new converts. Christianity was different. The Romans described Christianity as a superstitio, and it's easy to say, oh, it's just a superstition. But what that word really meant to ancient Romans was it was sort of like a contagious, crazed position. So they were sort of, Christians were spreading this contagious madness to other people. And so the Romans wanted to limit that, understandably.
Do you think that had anything to do with them being such a new movement? Had they been as established as Judaism and had those years of history behind them, might the Romans have treated them very much the same way?
I think if Christianity had been established, if it hadn't been trying to evangelize, and if it hadn't utilized this language of a new emperor and a new reign and a king who's going to come and change everything, that king being Jesus, then the Romans wouldn't have been interested in Christians at all. But because they did sound like revolutionaries, and because they were actively out there trying to get other people to convert, and thus other people not to participate in the structures of the Roman Empire, I think the Romans had every reason to be suspicious.
At the start of your book, you discuss the ancient Greco-Roman view of a good death. Now, of course, not everybody agreed on the specifics of what was actually worth dying for, but could you talk about the common ground that people generally did share regarding their views of what it was to die nobly or to have a good death?
Yeah, well, everyone in the ancient world knew that death was inevitable and that life was extremely fragile. And so they didn't sort of valorize trying to stay alive at all costs, the way that we do now. Instead, they felt that, if the situation demanded it, you should be willing to lay down your life for something greater than yourself, be that your family, and that's something we could identify with now, but also your country and your God, and also just your principles. These were things that it was worth dying for. That's how you really die like a man. And if you do die that kind of death, ancient Greeks and Romans and Jews all believed that you could expect to be remembered by others, to be remembered as a hero. And so everyone really valorized the good death and thought that this was one of the ways in which you distinguish yourself and be remembered.
Something I found interesting is that you argue that the author of Luke's Gospel does some significant editing in order to portray Jesus' death as in line with the Greco-Roman view of the good death. What are some of the relevant differences between Jesus' death portrayed in Luke's Gospel and Jesus' death as portrayed in Luke's earlier source material, the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, the differences are very striking. So when you think about Jesus in Mark, Jesus is sort of weak and unsure of himself. So when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, he pretty much begs God that he be allowed not to die. Mark says that he's grieved. Jesus in Mark begs the disciples to stay awake because he's upset. You know, he throws himself on the ground. He's distressed. There's no getting away from it.
Right.
Luke takes all of that out. So Luke has Jesus kneel down. Luke asks the disciples to pray, but it's almost like he's sort of instructing them. And then when you think about the actual deaths themselves, in Mark, the very last thing that Jesus says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, the last thing he says is, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It's incredibly self-controlled. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're just reading Mark, it sounds like he sort of dies in anguish. But in Luke, he's self-controlled, and it's almost like he wills himself to die, and then he does. It's a very different kind of death. It's sort of self-controlled and reserved and respectable. Everything that Mark isn't.
Right. It's the opposite of a humiliation, which is what you almost get from Mark, right? The suffering servant, misunderstood, humiliated up there on the cross, and then, cool, calm, confident Jesus in the Gospel of Luke.
That's right, and that's probably because Luke wants to sort of explain to his audience that Jesus really does die in the way that they admire. You know, he's like the philosophers.
So it's to kind of expand the scope of the appeal of the Christian message in a way.
That's right. I mean, it's not about lying. It is exactly about that. It's about expanding the appeal. It's about giving your audience something that they understand. And the audiences, Luke's gospel, understands the sort of cool, calm, collected death. Mm-hmm. They admire that. They don't admire someone who's being humiliated.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you talk about how some early Christian martyr stories seem historically suspect because they seem clearly influenced by earlier Greek, pagan, and Jewish motifs. Could you give a couple examples of that?
Right. Well, there are lots of places in early Christian martyrdom stories where the actual sort of script will come out of other early Christian texts. So martyrs will say things that Jesus said. They'll say things that the authors of the text have written elsewhere. In certain stories, like the famous Passion of Perpetua, she does a lot of things that sound like she's a heroine from sort of Greek mythology. So when she ascends this ladder to heaven, she is told not to look back, a little bit like Orpheus and Eurydice leaving the underworld. Just before she dies, she sort of tugs down her garment and exposes her neck. And the Latin there sounds a lot like a heroine of Greco-Roman mythology who is killed in a very similar fashion. You have to sort of look at the text and look at the flow of these stories. But it's clear that early Christians are sort of not directly copying, but definitely emulating these stories from Greek and Roman mythology and from ancient Jewish folklore.
This has been one of the reoccurring themes for me as I try to study more about biblical history is recognizing sets of conventions that were used in ancient literature, like themes that the audience would have recognized and understood right away, but because we're not always familiar with this ancient literature, it doesn't jump out to us in the same way.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't necessarily to us as modern readers, it doesn't jump out at us. But it would be a little bit like if you read a story and someone talked about the war on terror, you would know instantly that there is this reference to 9/11 and to terrorism. So even if the story was about something else, you would hear that.
Right.
You know? Or if I told you a story about in which someone said that they could not tell a lie, that would be very evocative to Americans. So I think that like when you look at them and you look at these stories placed alongside ancient Greek and Roman examples, suddenly they jump out at you and you realize, oh, this was really common. The death of Socrates was probably the best-known death in the ancient world. Everyone knew about how Socrates had been brave and had drunk hemlock. And so when you see allusions to that story in Christian literature, you know that the authors of those texts are trying to present their heroes as being like Socrates.
And so while some martyrdom stories seem to have borrowed from earlier traditions, others seem suspicious because they seem identical to other contemporary versions of the story. And so there would be, some narrative, and then there would be another narrative, and everything would be identical, with the exception of the actual names of the characters.
Almost like a form letter. Insert your martyr here, martyr's name here.
Yeah, that occurs more and more the later you go. Martyrs become incredibly popular in the Christian era after Constantine has allowed Christianity to become the state religion. And, there's a lot of pressure on these scribes and priests to write up stories of local heroes, and they'd be given the name of someone and they'd know nothing about them. And, it's hard work writing. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to just copy out another story and change the names. And that was what they did.
So a nice martyrdom template, in a way.
That's right. Exactly.
There's this very popular belief that about Emperor Nero, that he used the earlier Christians as a scapegoat for the Great Fire of Rome in 64, and of course as a result, many Christians were targeted and put to death in terrible ways. And this idea comes from Tacitus, the Roman historian, and he's writing in 115 to 120. And this is about 50 years after the fire, but your book gives us a few additional reasons why Tacitus's historical account is highly unlikely.
Yeah, and I should add real quick that this is part of what makes the story of Nero so credible to me. Is because it is written by Tacitus. It's not from a Christian source. It's not from one even sympathetic to Christian sources. Tacitus says some very terrible things. So you would think that would be some of the most sound evidence coming from him.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes people will criticize me for being skeptical of Christian sources, and they'll say, why are you so skeptical of Christian sources? Why aren't you skeptical of Roman sources? And I'll say, I'm skeptical of everything. I want to see the evidence. Mm-hmm. It's tempting to just believe Tacitus because he's a Roman historian. But we have to treat him the way we would treat any other historian.
Right.
And it's clear that Tacitus does not like Nero. None of the historians like Nero. And when it comes to Tacitus's evidence, I think what's curious is he says that Nero blames the Christians, which would mean that in the early 60s, the name Christian was sort of circulating widely enough that the Emperor Nero himself knew it. It's not just Christians calling themselves Christians. It would be other people recognizing them as such, so that even the Roman Emperor knew who they were. Mm-hmm. But Christians don't even start using that word to describe themselves until the end of the 1st century. So Paul, who was apparently killed by Nero, never calls anyone a Christian, never calls himself a Christian. So you have to wonder if it was really possible that during the reign of Nero that he knew enough about the existence of this small group of Jesus followers to target them. And we have to consider the possibility that Tacitus is retrojecting into the 1st century his own opinion of Christians, and that he's using that to sort of further condemn Nero, whom he doesn't like.
Obviously, Nero was not a pleasant fellow, so it seems kind of feels bad exonerating him. I do have a hero who apparently has some Christian blood on his hands too, Marcus Aurelius. Did you do any research on him? Is it true that he really did? Because he seems to me like such a compassionate guy, and from his writing, from his meditations, you hear that he talks about everyone living in harmony. And it's always been a disappointment for me to think that he had his hand in some of that persecution.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. I will actually tell you that some of the later Christian historians also tried to exonerate Marcus Aurelius and make it seem like he wasn't involved at all because they really liked him too. Mm-hmm. There were Christians who died during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and in fact they died in Rome. Now, they weren't tried by Marcus Aurelius, so if you're concerned about him personally, then I would say he might not have known.
Okay.
They were tried by one of his teachers called Rusticus, who he actually mentions in his writings as this amazing Stoic instructor. But in the Christian stories that Rusticus appears, Rusticus doesn't seem like that at all. He gets sort of angry and upset. not at all Stoic, which is really interesting because it seems like the Christian editors of this story are trying to sort of make Rusticus seem like he's not a very good Stoic, not a very good philosopher at all.
Yeah.
It's sort of fictional characterization. And this is the problem we have with so many of these stories. The Christians who are described in the story probably died. But the manner of their death, their trials, sort of whether or not they were being persecuted, that kind of information we just can't know because the stories have been, to an extent, reworked or edited, or some might say contaminated, by the interests of later Christian authors and editors.
So it's just impossible to say.
Right, and I know that's not satisfying, but it's important because, you can venerate martyrs without saying Christians are being persecuted. And given that this persecution stuff has had such a lasting impact in the Christian consciousness, it's important to admit what we don't know, and we don't know this.
Right. And I like that point that you make. And another thing that's sometimes not brought up in these conversations is that there were other martyrs for other causes back then, too. And we were just talking about Stoics a minute ago. Seneca was martyred. He was a teacher of Nero and apparently didn't stay on Nero's good side. We have a lot of stories coming out from these ages of people who lost their heads defending a noble cause. These stories are deeply satisfying, and maybe you could address that briefly. Are there some positive things to come out of these martyr stories for people who read them?
Yeah, I think there are. These are stories of courage and heroism, of sort of, I don't know if philosophers are ordinary, but of sort of regular people sort of overcoming the limitations of human frailty in order to be willing to die for what they believe in. And these are inspirational. I think my favorite Christian martyr is asked if he really thinks that he'll go to heaven if he dies. And he's a philosophical type of martyr, and he says, maybe not, but it would be worth dying because on account of Jesus, he had learned how to live a good and ethical life. And every time I read that story, I sort of, I pause because I think that's so admirable. And I think there are lots of positive things we can get out of these stories. And we can get that out of them whether or not every detail is true.
Right. With a lot of biblical studies, it's one thing to notice what this meant to the people who were reading them and why it was important in their development. And it's quite another the question of whether or not they are accurate. Yes, I'm glad you're saying that we can learn and admire these stories for one reason and then yet see the dark side to them, which unfortunately is all too common when, kicking prayer out of the public schools becomes persecution of the type, sometimes compared directly, of the type that are in these martyr stories. You have to start scratching your head and wonder if that's the message we should be taking away.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, for a number of reasons. The first is that that's just such overblown rhetoric when it comes to, say, kicking prayer out of public schools. And it completely avoids the debate, which is a debate about how we educate our children. And recasting that as sort of like an apocalyptic struggle between good and evil makes it impossible to have reasonable conversations about things. And at the same time, you're taking language that actually does still have meaning. People are persecuted, just not in America.
Right.
And sort of taking the language of persecution and applying it to sort of small political or social disagreements means that those stories really don't get heard.
Right. You want to see Christian persecution in this world, look at, the Coptic Christians in Egypt.
That's right.
There's plenty of, there's plenty of places, Sudan, we could just start going down a list where Christian persecution is real and needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and the reporting of that is overshadowed by the complaints of Americans that they're persecuted. So it does a lot of damage, I think.
You write that many Christians saw the death of Jesus as an ideal to strive towards, to such a degree that sometimes they would go to extreme lengths to achieve it. One instance that you discuss in your book centers around a mob of Christians in Arius Antoninus, the governor of Asia in 185. Could you tell that story?
Right. This story comes to us from Tertullian, who lived in North Africa, and he says that this whole group of Christians went to the governor's house and demanded that he sentence them to die for being Christians because they wanted to be a martyr, or be lots of martyrs, rather. And he told them that if they wanted to die, they had ropes to hang themselves with. He just wasn't going to participate in this. And it's such an interesting story. It demonstrates first that Christians weren't being persecuted. If there was any legislation against them, he would have had to have killed them.
Right.
But it also demonstrates that Christians took this very seriously. Sometimes we'll hear that Christians would never volunteer to die. They would never do this. They're always sort of passive, innocent victims. And it's worth noting that at the time when this happened, Christians haven't yet developed this sort of elaborate theory of suicide being wrong yet. So it's not as if these Christians think that they're doing something wrong. They just really idealize martyrdom, and they want to die as martyrs.
You could argue they're taking up their cross. I mean, I'm sure that's not exactly what Jesus meant, but yeah, you could argue that they were told from the beginning they need to emulate Jesus, and
that's right.
What better way to do that than to die for your faith?
Right. Yes. I mean, when Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me," he doesn't mean by giving money to charity. He means take up your cross and follow me. And so it is a sort of fairly faithful reading. I don't think that Jesus meant that you should seek out death like this, but you can see how people got there.
Considering that many Christians often see persecution as an intricate part of their personal Christian faith and of the broader Christian narrative, I'm curious as to what has been the reaction from the faith community to your book.
Yeah, well, I think it has been varied, shall we say. Some people have said, I think you're absolutely right. Others have said, we feel that we are persecuted and you are contributing to that. And this is a betrayal of Christianity and you should resign.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I get everything from you're the spawn of Satan to, great book. And I definitely get more negative emails than positive emails, but I hear that's the same for every product.
Yeah, which a reminder to our listeners, take the time out and send emails to authors that you think are doing a good job. Because they really do need that encouragement. I think it really does make a difference.
Yeah, I love this. I do have some really supportive fans, and they really do make a difference.
Candida, thanks again for taking the time out of your day to talk with us about your excellent book, The Myth of Christian Persecution, How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom.
And is there a website where we can direct our listeners to go to find out more about you and your writings?
There's my university page, which is on the Notre Dame theology site. I have an open Facebook page and a Twitter account, as you know. So any of those will do.
All right. We'll put links up to those at doubtcast.org. And yes, thank you again for joining us on Reasonable Doubts.
Thank you so much for having me.